She was worn and she was thin, a lonely woman solemnly gathering sticks in a lonely place. The yellow sun scorched the brown earth. It was a dry and desolate place. She had no fortune. She had no prospects for her future. And as a widow, she had no means of income save for a tiny dole from the monarchy or from her religious community. And after gathering the sticks, she would go home, kindle a small fire, and cook a last jar of cornmeal and oil for her son and for herself. She knew that she was going to die in the very near future. Food had run out. Time had run out. The end was near, and all hope for the future had died within her. So she bent over. She gathered her sticks for the very last time. Tears welled up in her eyes as she picked up the sticks one by one. She remembered the better times in her life, times in which her husband was alive, times in which food was plentiful and the family was in good health. But for her, those times were over. And she just kept gathering the wood, stick by stick, until her arms were very full. And suddenly, from a nearby bush, she heard a voice whispering to her, a voice proclaiming, "Bring me some water so I may drink." She paused, certainly surprised, but without looking in the direction of the voice, she moved toward the well to bring the stranger water. And then she heard the words, "Bring me some bread so that I may eat." And then the woman stopped. And she looked at this man and she said, "I have no bread except the meal in this jar. I am gathering wood for a fire so that I may go home and cook it for my son. You see, my son and I are ready to die." But that voice spoke again. That voice, seemingly a voice from the sky, but a voice out of the wilderness, but a voice standing in front of her saying, "Do not worry. Do not be afraid. Go and do as you have said. But before you eat, bring me some cake of the cornmeal first. And afterwards, then make some for yourselves, and then you may eat. For according to the word of the Lord, your jar of meal shall never be emptied, and your jug of oil will never fail until the day that the Lord sends final rains upon the earth." Think about it. What would you have done if Elijah had spoken to you in just this way? What did the woman do? She did exactly as she was asked. She responded obediently to the word of the Lord. She did what God, through Elijah, asked her to do. And because the widow's will and God's will were closely attuned, meaning that God's will and the widow's will were one will, God brought forth prosperity in her life. God took over her hopeless situation. God gave her a new life. But it was a time of need for Elijah also, just as it was a time of need for this widow. But sisters and brothers, whether it was for Elijah, whether or not it was for the widow, it was all, and this is what's important, it was all according to the word of the Lord. This morning, as we look at this story of Elijah and Zarephath, I am reminded that in each of our lives, God doesn't lay out a smooth path. God moves on that path, however, in some most mysterious ways. At any given time, we may not fully understand the precise way that God dealt with Elijah, but this we absolutely know. God moved because both Elijah and Zarephath trusted that when the unexpected happened, it would be no coincidence. It would be according to the word of the Lord. Sometimes the unexpected happens in each of our lives, doesn't it? The unexpected may be pleasurable, it may be delightful, but the unexpected may also be hurtful and disappointing. And when we look at what is happening, there just seems to be no explanation for what is going on in our lives. But this we know: when the unexpected happens, it is all according to the word of the Lord. I am reminded of a story, and some of you Carolinians may know about this little town. A little more than 100 years ago, the Methodists of Swan Quarter, North Carolina, had no church. The people had been frugal in their personal expenses, so they could give generously to build a very small white frame church with a tall steeple on top. There was a vacant lot in the center of town. It was the ideal location for the new church, but the shrewd and prosperous landowner, the one who owned that property, refused to sell it to the Methodists. How dare he? However, there was another piece of property on Oyster Creek Road, and it was far from the ideal location for that new church, but it would have to do. And so it was. The Methodists and other volunteers joined together in building the new church. It was a small church, but it was a sturdy church. It was a white frame church, and it was propped up on brick pilings. And finally, after many weeks and months of work, the little church was completed, and it was consecrated to the glory of God. But 3 days after the consecration, a terrible storm hit the Carolina coast, And that small community, in that small community, the wind howled, the rains came down, the creeks and rivers came out of their banks and flooded much of the town. And as the rain ceased and folks ventured from shelters, they saw only desolate waterscapes of a town which had been ravaged by water and inundated by a flood. However, those within sight of Oyster Creek Road beheld an unforgettable sight. The new Methodist church had been gently lifted from the brick pilings by the flood waters, and it was floating down the road. As folks watched the church make its way to the center of town, it veered off the road, headed for the vacant lot in the middle of town. And folks, that church stopped on that empty lot. And today, that same church stands on the same lot in the center of town. It stands as a beacon to the word of the Lord. It stands as a beacon to what God can accomplish in a church within each of us if we will but offer him our jar of meal and our jug of oil. So what does this have to do with us? I dare say that some of us sitting here this morning are measuring our days by lost causes, perhaps by dashed dreams. Some of us may be dangling by a thread that even those on the pew with us know nothing about. Some of us may be living on the jagged edges of despair, and we feel like every day is an abyss of hopelessness. There's a canticle of sorrow, pain, and grief enveloping our very being. And somehow, we have seemingly forgotten how to pray. We're depending on God less and less. Or we might take this story to another level, from a personal level to the level of God's church in the world today. Every church goes through times of scarcity and dearth. And this in itself is never a problem. The problem comes when God's church makes its history and its inner circles of power more important than God. Elijah was hungry for food, and a widow was hungry for a deeper faith and encouragement amidst her troubles. And God made a provision to satisfy both. Sisters and brothers, under every condition of scarcity, God makes provision. Under every provision, there is a backup. It's either about an individual or it's about a church. It's about a yearning to hold on to that which we've always had. But God works. And often, this is not God's plan. God is standing before the great United Methodist Church this morning. God is standing with our bishops, with our leaders, with our pastors. And God is standing in covenant with God's people in churches just like this today. And God is making provision. But God is making provision not according to our will, but according to the will of God. And sometimes in circumstances, God is providing new resources. At other times, God is helping each of us in the church to see whatever resources are in front of us in a different light, so that they might be used in new and different ways. The widow had cornmeal and the widow had oil, but she could not make them last on her own. And so it is for us as individuals and for God's church this morning. We as individuals in God's church today is unable to survive on its own strength. And certainly that which the world offers is not and never will be sufficient. Our strength comes, the strength for the future of this church, the strength for the future of God's universal church, comes from being spiritually attuned to God. And if either the United Methodist Church as a whole, or this church, or we in our individual lives choose to go our way, to be less than committed to making God's will our will, then the mysterious miracles that make life ever so special will cease. The main point is that God continues to be with us. God continues to offer grace upon grace to each of us and to God's church. God continually reaches out to reveal himself to us, but God never forces his presence upon us. Al Lindgren, a professor at Garrett Theological Seminary, tells of taking his teenage son fishing some years ago. And as they were sitting in the boat, just by the water and talking, his son suddenly asked, "Dad, what is the toughest thing that God ever tried to do?" The professor said the question, of course, caught him off guard. He didn't know what to say, and so he answered with a question. And I love it. "Well, what do you think, my son?" We've all done it, haven't we? The boy proceeded to answer his own question. "I thought the creation of the world," said the son, "might be the most difficult thing that God ever tried to do. But after thinking about it, I've decided that the toughest thing that God ever has to do is to get us to understand who God is." This morning, God is waiting for you and me. God is waiting for this incredible church. God is waiting for God's universal church today to truly understand who God is, to honor God and to make disciples of Jesus Christ. As we're preparing to soon receive a new pastor, let us choose to be open to change. Let us be creative in our thinking about new possibilities. And let us be spiritually attuned to face the future with confidence that God has greater plans for our lives as a church than we can yet imagine. Let us remember that with God, our jars of meals will never be emptied, neither will our jug of oil fail. This is God's message for God's people today. This is according to the Word of God. And all of God's people say, thanks be to God.